right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity, or AVA's webinar series, which we call Webinar Wednesdays because we have webinars pretty much every Wednesday. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yersich. With AVA, I'm an early career researcher and lead on the webinar series along with my amazing colleagues who are here today, Andrea Dean and Jason Novick. In addition to my role with AVA, I am the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children, housed at Simon Fraser University, and faculty in Sociology and Criminology at Capilano University. Before we begin, just a few procedural things. This is being recorded, like all of our other webinars, and it will be posted to our YouTube, so you can access it at any time, and you can share it as a resource with friends, family, and colleagues. Also, throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A feature to pose any questions you have for our speakers, and we'll have plenty of time at the end of their presentation for a Q&A. On a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in culture, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. Now, shifting to the focus of today, the title of today's webinar is Rethinking Prevention, the Roots of Sexual Violence and Intersectionality. We are joined with Kira Snodgrass and Mary Valenzuela of Calgary Communities Against Sexual Abuse, or CASA. If you'd like to learn more about CASA, the two speakers who are joining us today actually joined us last week for a webinar entitled Understanding Sexual Assault, Child Sexual Abuse, and Responding to Disclosures, which will be available also on our YouTube channel. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Kara is a sexual violence educator with CASA. Kira has a diploma in child and youth care from Lethbridge College and a bachelor's in health sciences and addiction counseling from the University of Lethbridge. Having always had the desire to work with those impacted by sexual violence, Kira's passion for the work deepened when she began working as a sexual violence support counselor in Lethbridge. Upon her relocation to Calgary, she was excited to join CASA with the same role. Her frontline experience on both the Lethbridge and Calgary sexual assault response teams has given her a unique perspective and understanding on the varying levels of impact sexual violence can have. Mary is a sexual violence educator with CASA as well. Her background is in sociology and women's and gender studies. She has been a sexual violence educator with CASA for over a year and has been program facilitator for various nonprofit organizations across the city for over 6 years. Mary's work as a sexual violence educator has amplified her passion for providing safe spaces for people to share their story and diverse experiences without the fear of judgment, as well as have conversations on difficult but extremely important topics. Kira, Mary, thank you for joining us again for such an important conversation. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for having us, Sarah. So as Sarah said, we will be talking about rethinking prevention, and we'll also be talking about anti-oppressive practice as it relates to sexual violence. So on our agenda for today, we are going to talk about some sexual violence statistics. For those who joined us last week, this will be a bit of a review, but we just want to make sure we have the correct foundation for the discussion today. We're also going to talk about traditional safety tips and how that corresponds with what we consider to be true prevention of sexual violence. We'll go over the roots of sexual violence. We'll talk about oppression, privilege, and intersectionality. And we'll go into understanding distancing practices and why we use them so often as well. We'll do a little bit of discussion on reporting, and then we'll give a bit of a brief overview on CASA services, time permitting, before we move into the question period. And I'll pass it over to you, Mary.
Alrighty, so as Kira mentioned, we are going to be going over some sexual violence facts and statistics here in a bit. And so for folks who have joined us last time, like Kira said, this will be a little bit of a review for folks, but for some, this might also be some new information. So, first off, we want to define sexual assault first. So it is any unwanted sexual act done by one person or more people to another, or it is any sexual activity without one person's consent or voluntary agreement. When we are talking about that consent, we are referring to true consent. So if there is some form of coercion or pressuring or threatening someone to give that consent, that is not considered as true or real consent, and sexual assault might have occurred in that situation. We know that in Alberta, so our statistics are more focused on our province here. We know that 2 out of 5 women are sexually assaulted in their life, and that 1 out of 5 men are sexually assaulted in their life as well. So we can really see that with these statistics, that sexual violence is pretty common. A lot of folks might think that sexual violence is something that does not happen a lot, but it does, and it can impact anyone regardless of their age, race, gender, etc. We also know that in 87% of sexual assaults, the individual knows the person who chose to assault them. So a lot of times people might think that it is strangers who engage in sexual violence or sexually assault people. But yes, that can happen in some cases, but a majority of sexual assault cases still show that it is done by someone that that person knows, whether that's a friend, an acquaintance, a family member, or an intimate partner. So really that debunks stranger danger. Like I said, it can still happen, but when we're looking at stats and facts, it is most often done by someone that a person knows. And we also know that less than 1% of sexual assaults involve major physical injury. So a lot of times people might also think that there's a lot of physical violence involved with sexual violence, but we know from numbers that it is less than 1%. There's not a lot of physical violence attached to sexual violence, because this is tied with the statistic in the previous slide that 87% of the time it's known, or the person who is harming them is known to the individual. So it does not involve a lot of physical violence, but it does have a lot of coercion, manipulation involved for sexual assault to occur. So when we are looking at some sexual assault facts here, we know that people rarely lie about being sexually assaulted. False reporting rates for sexual assault is the same rate as any other crime, and that is about 2 to 8%. So false reporting for sexual assault is the same as the rate for false reporting for theft or break-ins, or vandalism or stuff like that. We also know that people who choose to sexually assault others are responsible for their actions. So we have a lot of victim blaming narratives in our society, but we know, and we're going to explore that in the next few slides here, how the only person who can really stop sexual violence from happening and who is responsible for sexual violence from happening is the person who is engaging in it. So sexual assault happens because someone chooses to do it. Sexual assaults are never the fault of the person who experiences them. Any questions so far? And if you do have those questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A feature here.
Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit about traditional prevention or like safety tips that surround sexual violence. So for this, I am going to pick on our audience to see if we can get you folks engaged in the Q&A feature. So if folks don't mind, if you could put in the Q&A, or I don't know if you have access to the chat, but in one of those features, put in some of the traditional safety tips that we hear in relation to sexual violence. Okay, I'm not seeing any coming yet. Oh, go out with a group. Don't leave your drink unattended. Those are really common ones, hey? Um, Especially if you're going out anywhere past a certain time of day or a certain time of night, you should always go out with a group, cover your drink. That's why they've invented the drink covers that can be disguised as like scrunchies. I believe there's a nail polish as well that changes color if there's been like anything added to a drink. Yeah, great. Any other ones?
I think one of the
Don't,
things that I have been exposed to in university is having check-ins with your friends whenever you're
yeah,
out in
totally.
public.
Yeah, yeah. And like the location share too. I feel like that's also a common one. Someone mentioned on here, don't wear revealing clothing. Yeah, that's a really common one. That's one that I feel like dates back extra far. And I also feel like we have been challenging that narrative a little bit, but it certainly hasn't been challenged enough just yet. Those are great answers. I think another one is the common the common notion of like if you are walking to into a parking lot when it's dark out, you do like kind of the Wolverine thing with your keys where you have like keys between your fingers. Um, and someone also said, don't wear headphones while walking. Yes, that's a very common one. I know when I first moved to Calgary, I would take my dog to the dog park quite a bit. And we would walk there and we'd walk at the dog park. And I'd always get that comment from certain family members who are just concerned about like, don't wear your headphones and like listen to your podcast while you're walking the dog. And that's a tough one too, because my husband wasn't getting the same advice when he would take the dog, which is, again, very interesting and will lead us into some more conversation. Mary, is there any other common ones that you think we've missed?
One of the things that we always hear from folks are learn self-defense or like carry like a pepper spray. So pepper spray obviously is not legal here, but like carry a perfume or like something to spray the person with, just
Mhm.
enough to like immobilize them for a bit.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. And like, I think self-defense keychains were a big thing. I feel like a lot of that stemmed from the US, though. They do have less regulation on carrying stuff like pepper spray. I don't know exactly what that looks like. But there is also a spray that is used for dogs. So I've seen people suggest that folks carry that around because I think that's legal in Canada. Don't quote me on that though. But yeah, these are very common ones. And I guess my next question is, who are these tips mainly geared towards? Not all of them, but mainly. Yes, exactly. Women. That is just so true. A lot of these tips are geared towards women. They're not geared towards men, and we don't have the same type of concerns, right? Like I said, even about wearing headphones while walking. The same family members who were giving me that advice didn't seem to care if my husband was doing it, right? Someone said, and young women specifically. Totally. Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Why do we think that these safety tips dominate the conversation around preventing sexual violence? It Someone answered that there's focus placed on women rather than changing how men behave. So potentially like patriarchy makes the potential victim responsible for prevention instead of the person causing harm. It's part of the victim blaming culture. Yeah, those are all great answers. Well, they're not great in theory, but the answers are correct. So when we look at these, um, an important thing to note as well is that part of them have also come from a level of fear that we can have. A big piece of it does stem from rape culture and this victim blaming narrative that has been around for a very long time. and that we are, of course, trying to battle. But what I will say is that another level as to why folks embrace some of these classic safety tips is because we all just want to keep ourselves safe. I think it's a very terrifying idea to think about the fact that we could just be walking down the street and have something happen, that we could just be on a date and have something happen. It is just very scary. And we can't control the actions of other people, but we can control the actions of ourselves, right? So it's like, okay, well, if I do A, B, and C, maybe this won't happen. And that is such a fair thought that has been supported by this kind of victim blaming narrative. And so we, of course, always want folks to do what they feel they need to do to keep themselves safe. I always very open and honestly tell people that when we're talking about safety tips, as we talk about the fact that, we shouldn't have to even have these because it's a conscious choice that someone else is making to hurt someone. But these are tips that I've shared with my younger sister who's going to college in the fall, because we want us and our loved ones to be safe. And it is scary to think about the fact that things can just happen. You know, we try, I think, to find ways to keep ourselves safe, and that can stem from a lot of things. I always share when we're talking about this that I was in a car accident a couple years ago, and it was completely not my fault, ruled that way by even the person that caused it. But I still spent a huge amount of time trying to figure out what I could have done differently so that didn't happen, because it really did scare me and cause a lot of fear about the fact that I could just be driving to go get Starbucks and get into a car accident at no fault of my own. I didn't like the lack of control element there. So I was looking for those things where it's like, well, like what could I have done different? And that is where we often will see folks who have experienced sexual violence try to figure out what they could have done differently or how they could have done something different to not experience that. And while that's something where it's like, no, there's nothing you could have done different because it's not your responsibility. Someone else chose that. While we really try to focus in on that, we can also hold space for people about the fact that, we just want to be safe. And that's why some of these safety tips exist, and that's why they continue to be used, and that's completely okay. But they should not dominate this conversation because, and we'll talk about it in a moment, it's not true prevention. When we look at intent versus impact, I think we can very specifically understand that the intent of safety tips or these traditional prevention methods are to keep people we love and ourselves safe, right? Same reason why some of us embrace some of these traditional prevention methods or safety tips. Same reason why I give this presentation, yet I still gave these same tips to my little sister. The intention is to try and keep folks safe. But what is the impact? The impact is that it actually kind of supports the victim blaming narrative, because when someone experiences sexual violence with this narrative in the background, it's like, well, did I not do my responsibility, heavy quotes on that, to prevent this? And that can be difficult. And so one of the things that I personally did when I was sharing some of these tips with my little sister was have the conversation around the fact that you shouldn't have to do this. This is not your responsibility for this to not happen. If this does ever happen, there's no responsibility on you. But I just want you to be safe. I don't want anything bad to ever happen. So that is an important part of when we're talking about the intent versus impact of the safety tips is, unfortunately, sometimes these safety tips do construe a narrative around sexual violence that is victim blaming. And so it is really important that when we are sharing these, if we are sharing these, that we are understanding that potential impact and making sure that we steer away from that and explain that you know, that it isn't true prevention. And we'll talk about true prevention in a moment here. But that is the piece. Unfortunately, these same safety tips that we've used to try and keep ourselves safe, with good intentions of not wanting to experience harm, have had an impact of kind of echoing that victim blaming narrative, right? Because then it does become a question by some people about, okay, well, did you do A, B, and C to prevent that? Or, well, why did you leave your drink unattended? Or why did you do this or that, right? So it is just important that we understand the impact of these. Mary, I'll get you go the next slide. We'll talk about true prevention a little bit. So when we are talking about prevention, because when we talk about the safety tips, some of that is the fact that a lot of folks will label that as prevention work. But we know that isn't true prevention, because prevention is stopping something from happening and addressing the problem at its root. That is what prevention is. It is not trying to put up safeguards to prevent something from happening to someone. It's addressing the problem at the root cause, which is sexual violence. It's stopping it before it starts. And we will talk about the roots of sexual violence, and how we can go about challenging those and working on that true prevention piece. And Mary, I'll go ahead and pass it back over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kara. So as Kara mentioned, when we're talking about real prevention, it's really important that we look at the roots of sexual violence, because that is what true prevention is addressing the very foundations of what is wrong. So one thing, or there are a few things that we need to discuss when we are looking at prevention, and really to understand how we can make that change in our society. And the first thing is by looking at the sexual violence pyramid, or to understand the roots of sexual violence, or why it happens and why it continues to happen in our society. So for folks who have joined us last time, this might be familiar to you, but with the sexual violence pyramid, just to preface it for folks, even if it's shaped as a pyramid, it does not show a hierarchy of impacts. So the verbal expressions, the physical expressions, those are not more harmful than the attitudes and beliefs. Just because something is at the top, that doesn't mean that they're more impactful than the ones below. All of these things hold their own impact. All of these things are harmful on their own. And it's just really up to the people who are experiencing them to make sense of those impacts. But what we can say is that when we're talking about the pyramid, is it shows us how the attitudes and beliefs serve as the roots of sexual violence. So these are things that influence how we view ourselves, how we view other people, how we treat ourselves, and how we treat other people as well. And oftentimes, unfortunately, these attitudes and beliefs come in the form of discrimination. And we see that through isms. So those isms are discriminatory attitudes and beliefs that we all get exposed to throughout our lifetime. And they are systemic, which means that they influence how our society functions, how we approach things in our society. And so these attitudes and beliefs, they give one group of people in society more power and control compared to another one. And so when people internalize that power and control that they have, if they do, if they are part of that dominant group, they might think that it's okay to disregard someone's consent or disregard someone's boundaries. And that is when we see sexual violence starting. So when people are now acting on those attitudes and beliefs through verbal expressions of sexual violence, like sexual harassment, then that is them applying that power and control, and also taking power and control from people because they see those people as beneath them, or someone who have less power and control compared to them. When people are not being challenged for those harmful verbal expressions, then they might think it's okay to continue engaging in more physical expressions of sexual violence, like sexual assault or sexual abuse. Um, and that is, again, still applying those harmful attitudes and beliefs, which are the roots of sexual violence. Just for explanation purposes, we also put suicide and homicide at the top of our pyramid because we believe that that is the last form of violence that could happen as a result of sexual violence. Okay, so when someone takes another person's life or someone takes their own life as a result of sexual violence, then that's the last form of violence that could potentially happen. But really, when we are looking at the roots of sexual violence through the sexual violence pyramid, um, it helps us understand how some people might be disproportionately affected by sexual violence. And it really emphasizes how sexual violence is something that does not happen overnight. It is something that happens through someone's lifetime. They get exposed to many different experiences, to many different ideologies while growing up, and that really influences whether or not they will engage in sexual violence in the future. They don't just wake up one day and decide, oh, it's a good day to engage in sexual violence today. That is not the case. The pyramid also helps us understand why sexual violence happens. It is not because someone is wearing a certain type of clothing, or someone did not cover their drink, or someone went out alone, or maybe someone um, had a drink. Those are not reasons why sexual violence occurs. Sexual violence happens because someone chooses to do it, and someone chooses to act on those harmful attitudes and beliefs that they have learned in the past. Okay. But with that, another piece that we want to look at when we're talking about prevention and anti-oppressive practice is oppression. So when we're looking at oppression, it is those experiences or systems and or individual actions that establish and reinforce a harmful or dehumanizing power dynamic of one group over another. And we can see that with the isms that exist at the bottom of our pyramid. So those isms reinforce those power imbalances within our society and makes these power imbalances more systemic, or something that exists on a societal level. It is also rooted, oppression is rooted in historical context, which means that it is something that has happened in the past and is something that continues to happen in the present. It is reinforced by systems and institutions. That is why it continues to happen in the present, which means that we're not only talking about an individual oppressing another person when we're talking about oppression. We are also looking at how oppression exists within those systems where we exist in society. So it can be systems working against people. So this could be laws, policies, all that stuff. When we are talking about how oppression shows up, we know that it is through a social process and it is ongoing and repeated. Oppression can also be overt or it could be subtle. So, like I said, it could look like someone oppressing someone in a very overt way with harmful behaviors, but it can also be very subtle. So it can be through our laws, workplace policies, and it could just be limiting someone from having opportunities to take space or to hold space in certain aspects of their life. It could be limiting people's access to opportunities, but it is through those policies or laws as well. As an immigrant, something that I have seen from my own personal experience is how a lot of immigrant credentials are not being honored, but that is a system that is built or in place that limits those opportunities. So it is an example of a subtle way of oppression showing up. When we talk about oppression, it is also very important that we talk about privilege and exclusion because they are tools of oppression that uphold those power imbalances. So again, so privilege, we'll be talking about that in the next slide here. But when we're talking about exclusion, again, this can be overt and this could also be subtle. So when there is a lack of representation in conversations that might impact people, that is them being excluded in that conversation that can heavily impact their experience or their life. So those are forms of oppression that we have to recognize when we want to talk about real prevention and when we want to talk about anti-oppressive practice and how we can incorporate that in how we support people who come to us with an experience of sexual violence. Kira, did you have anything to add to that so far?
No, I feel like you covered it for sure.
Awesome. So we're gonna move on to talking a bit more about privilege. So privilege refers to certain social advantages, benefits, or degrees of prestige and respect that an individual has by virtue of belonging to certain social identity groups. So we like to frame it as privilege is the opposite or the other side of oppression. So just being a part of a group that is automatically accepted in society or someone who is worthy of inclusion, good treatment, respect, and support, that is what privilege means. Right? Having privilege also means that you have access to power that is enjoyed by the dominant group that you are a part of, which gives you a lot more advantages in society, whether that's economic advantages, political, social, or cultural advantages. But that is at the expense of people who are marginalized or people who do not experience the same privilege that you would have. So when it comes to privilege, it is something that we do not always see and something that we have innately, but like I said, we don't recognize that we do have privilege a lot of times until we see someone, like another person struggle with it, or we see someone that we care about struggle with that, or if there is ever a situation in our lives where that privilege is being taken away from us. And that's not a bad thing. There's no shame if you do not know if you have privilege, but just being able to recognize that if folks have that privilege, that you are able to use that in your power to actually make a change in society. But when we are connecting privilege to sexual violence, we know that people who have privilege do not often talk about things that they don't see as impacting them or issues that they think might not really happen to them until they see someone in their life experience it. And that is when those moments of like realization and moments where they now see that privilege, that is when it opens their eyes to the reality of that situation. But that is talking about privilege is really important when we're also engaging in anti-oppressive practice. And another concept that we like to talk about when we are talking about anti-oppressive practice is intersectionality. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. It is a theoretical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities might combine to create unique modes of discrimination. So basically, what intersectionality is the idea that we have different aspects of our identity that intersect to create simultaneous experiences of oppression. But at the same time, I think that with intersectionality, there are also some spaces in our lives where we might hold privilege, and that is also something that we would like to recognize. But when we are incorporating the idea of intersectionality within our practice, we know that we're not treating issues separately because that does not necessarily address the harm that is being done, because we have to look at the person from a holistic perspective, because not one part of their identity will define that experience. There are many different things that will impact how they make sense of that experience or deal with the impacts as well. With just Kira and I alone, you can see we have different experiences. We come from different backgrounds. And so there are areas in our lives that we might take privilege in. Maybe I take, or Kira has privilege in some areas, but are oppressed in some. And that would also be the same for me. There might be areas in my life that might cause me to experience more discrimination compared to other people who might have the same experience. Any questions from folks so far?
One thing I will say on intersectionality, usually in our full presentation, that's about 3 hours in length, we watch the TED Talk by Dr. Crenshaw on intersectionality, but it is like a 15-20 minute TED Talk. So we don't have time for that today, of course, but I do encourage folks to watch it because I don't know, Mary and I have watched it countless times at this point, and each time I just feel like I take away something a bit different, and it's very, very powerful. Can be quite emotional, but is also very powerful. So I definitely recommend that as a great resource for folks who want to explore intersectionality a bit more.
Awesome. Thanks for mentioning that, Kira. Alrighty, I'm going to hand it off to Kira to talk about some distancing practices.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So folks may have heard about distancing practices. For others, it might be a new term, or it might just put a name on something that we all do often. So to define distancing practices, it's really just what we do to distance us from the root of the problem and the problem in general. This is a very common thing that we see in sexual violence, but we see it in a lot of different things, right? There's a lot going on in the world right now, politically, economically, all that good stuff. And sometimes we may try to distance ourselves from it because we'll be like, oh, that's happening somewhere else. Not our problem right now, until it then does become our problem. And then we view it as impactful. But sometimes I think distancing practices can be viewed as something very negative, and it definitely has negative impacts. But the reason why we do it is because it just lets us feel an element of safety, and that can be like physical, mental, emotional, or psychological safety, and to kind of give us a level of control in our minds over something that isn't in our control most of the time. So we can like think that maybe we can prevent something bad from happening. The way that distancing practices exist in sexual violence can be pretty multifaceted, but one thing, so in a workplace saying, well, sexual harassment doesn't happen here. It can, right? So not really removing ourselves from that, because for one, maybe we're fearful to experience it. Maybe it's something that the idea of it makes us uncomfortable. So if we say it doesn't happen here, then it doesn't happen here. Or what actually happens is that it's really just not talked about or not believed or anything of the sort, or not addressed. Another thing that we hear commonly when we talk about child sexual abuse specifically is, yeah, that doesn't happen in this community, or no, that would never happen in our family. Part of that is from not having the true understanding of sexual violence and how prevalent it is, including child sexual abuse, but also the fact that it is not something that anyone ever wants a child to experience. And therefore, being able to distance and say, no, that wouldn't happen here, helps us feel safer, even if it is just kind of that mental piece. And we can also view traditional safety tips as a distancing practice too. If I do A, B, and C, this won't happen. If I don't go to these types of places, this won't happen. And unfortunately, we just know that that's untrue. We know a lot of the safety tips we were talking about, folks were right. A lot of them are geared towards women, young women specifically, but also a lot of them are geared towards experiencing sexual assault from a stranger, which Mary had shared at the start of the presentation is significantly less common. 87% of the time, it's someone who's known to us that chooses to harm us in that way. And with child sexual abuse specifically, it's 88% of the time. So it's pretty consistently people we know that harm us in that way. And that's a difficult thing. But that also does kind of poke another hole in the idea of safety tips as true prevention, because it's not. It's not actually targeting the true nature of how sexual violence shows up. And it's not true prevention because it's not targeting it at the root. So that is a little bit about distancing practices. One thing I will note is that when it does come to distancing practices as well, it's not a shameful thing to use these sometimes. I think sometimes we need to be able to separate ourselves from some of the stuff that is going on in the world, but we have to be able to understand that what we're doing in that moment is a distancing practice, so that we aren't essentially minimizing the situation or removing ourselves from it, because there is a level of privilege in that, and we need to be able to see the true roots of something and understand when we are using a distancing practice to allow us to feel a bit safer for a while. Let's talk a little bit about supporting disclosures of sexual violence before we move into talking about what we would consider true prevention as it relates to sexual violence. So I know last week we had talked a bit about supporting and key messages. We're just going to go over that again because it's so, so important. With the stats Mary shared, it's unfortunately quite clear that probably all of us know someone who has experienced sexual violence, and therefore being able to support and have these key messages of support is very important. So we have our 5 key messages that we refer to at CASA. And we don't necessarily tell folks to say this word for word. It doesn't need to be scripted when we're supporting, but really allowing these messages to be the base of our support and to allow that to fuel the messages we give when we are supporting is very important. So I believe you, very, very important. A lot of folks unfortunately feel like they won't be believed if they disclose sexual violence. And unfortunately, a lot of that does come out of that victim blaming narrative that we have talked about, and overall rape culture in our societies. It's not your fault. Like I said, unfortunately, shame and self-blame are so common with sexual violence, and it just shouldn't be, but it is. And so we can remind folks that it's not their fault what they experience. They have no responsibility in the situation. Someone chose to harm them. It's not about what they were wearing. It's not about them walking home alone at night. It's about someone else making a conscious choice to cause harm. Your needs come first. This is a really important one. I think a lot of the time people will feel like they almost have responsibility to prevent this from happening to someone else, or they can't necessarily like seek the support that they need for other reasons, and just reminding them that their needs are important and they are who comes first in the situation. Your feelings are valid, or your feelings are normal. While we don't want to normalize sexual violence, there are certain feelings that are innate in an abnormal situation, like experiencing sexual violence. So just being able to normalize feelings for folks is really important. And I support your decisions. This is super impactful, especially when it comes to stuff like reporting, or even seeking support. Some folks might be like, yeah, counseling, that sounds amazing. I would love to do that. And for other people, that might not sound like something that would be beneficial. So whether or not we have the opinion that they should or shouldn't seek counseling support or other supports, or if we have an opinion about whether they should or shouldn't report their experience, that is something we keep to ourselves. We all have our opinions, we all have bias, but we are there to support someone and their decision and to help reinstate a little bit of that autonomy. And yeah, even if it's maybe not what we would choose to do for ourselves, as Mary mentioned, when it comes to intersectionality, we all experience stuff differently, right? So impacts look different for everyone. And so it is important that we are being supportive of the decisions of folks in how they choose to go about processing, healing from their experience of sexual violence. All right, Mary, I'll pass it back over to you for true prevention.
Alrighty. So, given all the stuff that we talked about, how do we actually prevent sexual violence? And the biggest answer to that is we strive for true prevention, which is really addressing the roots of sexual violence. So when we look at that, or when we remember the sexual violence pyramid, we can see the foundation are those attitudes and beliefs. And so if we take that foundation piece down and remove it, everything just comes crumbling down, right? And so when we are wanting to make the biggest change and when we are working towards true prevention, what we want to focus on to make the biggest change in society are those attitudes and beliefs that sit at the bottom of that pyramid. So we want to shift those perspectives and really change those attitudes and beliefs, starting with our own self. Right? When we try to challenge our own beliefs and our attitudes, especially towards sexual violence, then we can help educate other folks as well and challenge those perspectives and behaviors that we can see with other people too. We also want to learn about sexual violence. So, really engaging in workshops like these or other opportunities to engage in conversation around sexual violence to contribute to that knowledge sharing about the topic and spreading awareness about sexual violence. With education, um, with what we do at CASA, something that we talk about is true prevention, regardless if we are talking to adults or if we are in schools talking to young folks. We always tell them that if we want to work towards true prevention and we really want to make a change around the topic of sexual violence or issue of sexual violence, that we really need to challenge those attitudes and beliefs that we are all exposed to and learn more about ways to talk about sexual violence and support people who have experienced sexual violence. A lot of true prevention also involves policy change. Um, Obviously, that takes a while, and that is something that people really need to work towards. Together. And it takes a lot of advocacy work for policies to change. But when we are addressing those, again, when we're addressing those roots, the more people are talking about the issues that surround sexual violence and the more that we are trying to challenge that and working on advocacy projects around it, the more that it becomes a huge topic and people who engage in policy making are hearing us louder. So just keep on talking about it, keep on spreading awareness until people who can change the law, can change policies, actually listen. We also want to engage folks in masculinities work. So we want to look for ways on how to engage boys and men in this conversation and really promote healthy masculinity when we are having a conversation with folks around the topic of sexual violence. We also want to talk about healthy relationships. One thing, again, going back to the statistic that 87% of the time it is done by someone who is known to the person. We know that sexual violence can happen in those relationships that we have with people. And so just being able to talk about healthy relationships and having those conversations at home is a good start. Having them with your kids, talking about consent, talking about boundaries, healthy boundaries, and all that stuff can really help in working towards true prevention. And lastly, which kind of summarizes everything, is really education. When we educate ourselves and we also try to educate other people, then we have more people working towards true prevention. And we have more people challenging their own perspectives, shifting their perspectives, shifting their behaviors as well. And that's just really creating a huge, huge ripple effect in our society. Um, just a quick note on challenging. When we are challenging people on their behaviors or their perspectives, it is important that we don't only just call them out, but we try to call them in. So other than calling out that behavior, we want to make sure that we're also educating them on how to change that. We're replacing misconceptions with facts. So they're also aware of how they can make that change within themselves, and they can also spread that awareness to other people too. But when we're working towards true prevention, when we're doing all of these things, when we're changing those attitudes and beliefs, we're starting to dismantle that pyramid of sexual violence. And we're also trying to challenge rape culture, which is the very thing that normalizes sexual violence. Alrighty. And with that, like I said, when we are trying to shift that perspective, there are many other ways. There are many, many ways that we can actually do that. We can join campaigns, and really get involved in society. There are a lot of folks who do amazing work in the community around sexual violence, advocacy, and really standing up for people who have experienced it and also supporting it. It could be really big campaigns like the Me Too movement or the museum that showcased like what people were wearing when they were sexually assaulted. So all of these things, no matter how big or small, they are impactful and they are one step towards changing society and building a world free of sexual violence. So just be on the lookout for things that are happening in your like smaller communities or in your city, if you want to get involved and really mobilize that change around sexual violence. Yeah. Um, Alrighty. I am gonna pass it over to Kira to talk about our CASA services.
Thank you, Mary. And for the sake of time, I'll just do a little bit of a brief overview. I know we had kind of touched on some of these last week, but at CASA, so we are the Sexual Assault Center for Calgary and surrounding area, and we have our support and information line that is available every day of the year from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And even if folks aren't from Calgary, we can still support them on the line and help them access the nearest sexual assault center to them if that is something that they would like to do. We can also help with some resourcing for folks in their area too. Another piece with the support and information line is that it is also anonymous, so it's confidential. And it is also a good tool, even if you have someone in your life you're wanting to support, or you have a question about how you can get engaged in sexual violence work too. It really is there for any level of information providing, support, and that sort of thing. We also have our public education team, which also partners in the community outreach space. So Mary and I primarily do public education. So we really kind of go anywhere that we're wanted. So we'll do education on a variety of topics, both in person and virtually. We also do like booths and information spaces at different community events as well. And we have our child and youth team that goes into schools and other programs like summer camps and that sort of thing to teach younger folks about sexual violence in an age-appropriate manner, of course, starting with ages 5, I believe, up until 18, or I guess 17. We have our police and court education and support team. So this is a great team that helps folks who are considering reporting or have reported and just helps advocate for them along the process. They're not legal experts, but they have an understanding of what the legal system looks like and supports and areas of advocacy along the way that they can provide. Sexual assault response team also supports folks who have experienced sexual assault as recent as 7 days for Calgary and surrounding area. And it is an excellent team with experts who are female identifying that can support. We also offer individual and group counseling. So for this, I'll talk about the referral process in a moment, but folks who have experienced sexual violence, whether it be recent or historic, can engage in that program if they are a fit. We have our wonderful volunteer engagement program. Our volunteers go through so much training to be a part of CASA, and we truly do value them. They do so much for us. And we have integrated case management. So this team that we've referred to as ICM really does help bridge the gap for people who maybe aren't ready to begin trauma counseling right yet, because that is a very long and difficult process, but are still needing some support and some psychoeducation work. Speaking to our referral process for our programs, we use a self-referral approach, meaning that if folks are wanting to engage in our programs, they can just call our support and information line to begin that process. One thing that we'll talk about too is that we do what is called an intake assessment upon self-referral. So when we book someone for an intake assessment, it is really important to note that it does not mean that someone will right away be into CASA services and that they'll right away be a fit. We really want to ensure client safety, and if they are not currently in a position to begin trauma work, specifically sexual violence trauma work, then we discuss that with them, talk about some steps and some other resources they can use to get to that spot where it is appropriate for them to begin that process. We do try to focus on consulting with other professionals within the client's life, of course, with that client's permission, just to really provide that well-rounded support. In terms of our support and information line, one thing I did forget to mention is that professionals can use that line to kind of just even inquire about if CASA would be a fit for a client of theirs, but also to potentially do a little bit of case consulting. So one thing with that is that if someone is looking to do that, they should call Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and ask for a counseling supervisor for a case consult or like specific professional consulting. Mary, I'll get you go the next slide. So you heard me mention about if someone is ready to engage in CASA services. So the focus of that is safety and stabilization. So ensuring that mental health is in a position where engaging in trauma work would not pose great risk to the client. Same thing with substance use or addiction, ensuring that that is not something that would impact a client's ability to engage in the work in a safe and effective way as well. Another piece is this something that someone wants? A lot of the time, and I mentioned it when I was talking about supporting, folks can kind of get pushed into doing trauma counseling for sexual violence experience, and it might not be something that they're wanting to address at the time. It might not be their primary concern. A lot of the time, if someone is presenting with a multitude of concerns, but someone hears sexual violence right away, they're like, oh yeah, CASA, you need to address that. Sometimes folks don't feel that it is something they need to address, or maybe it's not something they need to address at the time. It might not be their main concern. So just making sure that it is something that is a primary concern for the client, and it is something that they are wanting to address at this time before engaging in services. So yeah, like I said, self-referral can be booked in for an intake assessment, and then if they are deemed to be a fit for services, that process would get started. And if they're deemed not to currently be a fit for services, then there will be some discussion around what that looks like and why they might not currently be a fit, and how they can shift into being a fit for the services. So folks, I do have a survey link on here. If you don't mind giving us your feedback, we'd really appreciate it. One thing I'll note about the survey is that it's going to ask you for your name. You don't need to put your name. You can just like hit the space bar a couple times or put a fake name, anything of the sort. We really value feedback. On your phone, if that's how you're doing it with the QR, you have to scroll all the way down to answer all the questions and then go all the way back up to hit save and submit. So if you don't mind doing that, that would be wonderful. I'll give a couple more seconds for that to be up, and then I will pass it over to, not to Mary. I'll have Mary go to the next slide so that we can show our support and information line number. Like I said, that is operational 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day of the year. And then we also have the number for Alberta's one line for sexual violence that folks can call or text. We do help with that phone line for Southern Alberta as well. And then, sorry, the operational hours for that line are the same as CASA's. And then we also have a 24-hour sexual violence support line on here too, for, again, that 24-hour support. We are not affiliated with that line, though I have heard positive feedback from folks who have accessed that line before. And while we have those numbers up, we do just have a question in the Q&A about the video for intersectionality and the name of it. I don't remember the exact name of it. It is the Intersectionality TED Talk by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. Honestly, as soon as you look up TED Talk intersectionality, it will come right up. It'll be the first video.
Well, thank you both so much. That was a fantastic talk. Between last week and this week, it's woven a really complex, nuanced, but accessible explanation for your work and the importance of it and how you go about doing it, from what sexual violence is and its impacts to things like prevention and intervention. I do want to remember those who are with us that if they have any questions, they should please put them in the chat and our speakers would be happy to answer them. I also do want to give everyone just a little nudge. Jason will be putting the link to our AVA webinar survey in the chat, so please take that as well. While we're waiting on the Q&A, I did wonder, I know that you've both been in the education space and the intervention space throughout a large part of your careers. As you were learning how to do interventions and the key points of even teaching other people about interventions, what did you find most compelling or surprising about the process?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think it really kind of depends. I think for me, what I always noticed when it came to kind of intervention work was the fact that nothing is a one size fits all. So you have to be able to have like a million different approaches in your back pocket so that you can shift. And I think intersectionality speaks to that a lot. Two people can experience the same thing and have very different impacts. So I think the fact that, yeah, the focus of not one size fits all has kind of been the most key piece for me, because not only does that pose challenges, but it also poses the opportunity to provide adequate intervention and support to folks. So yeah, I think that's probably my answer.
I'm actually on the same page as Kira. And yeah, for the very reason that it does have like it becomes conversations interesting because yes, we do need to have multiple different approaches to different groups depending on who we have. But other than what they learn from us from a variety of perspectives, I love how us educators also learn from them in the process, because we now build on our knowledge on how to speak about the topic in many different ways that will be relatable to other people as well. Because again, one experience can look very different for two people, even just two people. So imagine if we're talking to 10 people who come from different backgrounds, it's a variety of knowledge, information, and experience in that one room. And that's actually an amazing conversation, to be
Mhm.
honest. But yeah.
Absolutely. And I always found that interesting too, thinking about the one size fits all models. We spent so many years trying to get some formulaic checkbox things so that there was consistency in how we respond. And then we learned so shortly after that, but everyone's lived experiences are so unique. You
Mhm.
can't actually have a checkbox approach. And so we've moved back to
For
that
sure.
intuitive piece.
Yeah, definitely. I think a checkbox can be like a good tool to have in your back pocket for like commonalities, but it's
Yeah.
just not something that can be that your framework can be completely built upon. Because yeah, you have to be able to have that flexibility to shift. And I think even to what Mary was saying, like we learn every time we do this presentation with folks. We could do the same presentation with 5 different groups, and Mary and I will take away a different learning ourselves. And that's what's super cool about it. And so being able to be flexible, to always be in a state of wanting to learn and being willing to learn too, I think that is just so impactful. Because yeah, no two people will experience something in the exact same way, even if it was the exact same experience. So I think, yeah, unfortunately, the one size fits all approach just doesn't cut it.
hmm And just to add on to that, it's actually interesting that Kira mentioned like having 5 presentations with or like with 5 different groups. I remember my partner asking me yesterday, do you ever get bored presenting the same thing
Mm,
every single time? And I'm like, weird for me to say, but I don't. Because it's always an interesting conversation and it's always a different conversation, even if it's the same topic over and over again, because you have different groups who have different experience, who are sharing different perspectives on things. So it's always an interesting conversation and you would never really get bored, even if we're literally like, let's say we present sexual assault and responding to disclosures 5 times in a week, it's gonna be different for each one.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, that is so true.
That's that's really kind of I don't know, it's refreshing to hear because I always made that same assumption too that if you give the presentation a bunch of times, you're just going to be tired of giving it. And so
Mhm.
it's refreshing to hear that actually it's dynamic in the way that you engage with it and that you learn a lot through the process.
Mhm.
Yeah, for sure. I think it was interesting. One time we did a presentation on child sexual abuse and responding to disclosures from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. And then the next day we did it from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. And I remember being like, man, that's going to feel repetitive. It
Mhm.
felt like almost two different present because the conversations are different, right? People's perspectives are different, people's lived experiences are different. And yeah, it really does just allow us to constantly be learning too, which is
Mhm.
really, really, really wonderful.
Absolutely. That's so, yeah. It's something you never think about until you hear someone else say it, and then it's eye-opening.
Mhm.
All right. I don't think we had any questions come in, but I know you had a very engaging presentation, which was wonderful to listen to. So just from me, a big thank you on behalf of me and Ava. It's been such a wonderful thing having you as webinar guests for 2 weeks in a row. I know I've learned so much from your presentations, as I'm sure we all have. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.